I'm Sam Melnick. I'm the Vice President of Customer Success and Insights here at Acadia, and I'm really happy to be here today. And I want to thank everyone for joining us. Particular thank you, since I run customer success. I want to particularly thank everyone, but particularly our customers who the great partnership you provide in taking your time today to spend with us. So I'm joined by Brett Kahnke, who is the principal analyst over at Forrester. And I've been talking about budget and marketing budgets for at least the last decade of my career. So when the marketing team said, we're going to do a workshop on strategic budget allocation, I was pumped. And I'm a bit of a marketing nerd, so marketing budgeting gets me excited. My wife rolls her eyes about it. That's all right. It's not for everyone. But before I hand it over to Brett to kind of dive in, I want to cover a couple of housekeeping items here. So first of all, this is going to be a workshop that we do have a workbook around it. If you didn't get it in a prep email, Ada has popped it into the chat. And just click on the link there and download it. It will be interactive. We won't spend too much time on it, but it's really a bit of a hands-on. Brett did a great job designing it. Same thing when it comes to technical difficulties or any questions. We've got Ada on the back end running the chat. You can go there. We're here to support. We're here to help. So one other thing, we will be walking through this workbook that I talked about, but it is meant for this workshop and not templates to do your planning for, but more give you examples of how to work through this hands-on again and ideas on how you go through the planning process. So Brett, I'm going to hand it over to you to dive in here.
All right, thank you, Sam. As Sam mentioned, my name is Brett Kahnke. I'm a principal analyst working on marketing operations strategies with Forrester on the Serious Decisions product line. I'm really happy to be here today. In my day job, I am helping clients get a better understanding of how to do marketing budgeting planning, as well as measurement, analytics, and data. But today I get to play with you in the marketing budgeting space, which is everybody's most fun time of the year. What you're going to walk away with today is hopefully a better understanding of the need to separate your past spending decisions from your future planning. The choices that we made in the past with our marketing budget, we're focused on objectives from a different time. And companies need to be nimble enough to understand that needs change, and so do the allocations of our spend. Second, I'm going to make sure that you have an understanding of the key requirements for strategic budget allocation. That's what we call the process that I'm going to walk you through, including goal setting, building a campaign framework, and understanding your past data. Hopefully, you'll be able to recognize each of the decisions involved in the process, as well as the decision makers at each step. We'll do some illustrative examples of that allocation process. And I'll say up front that all the examples I'm going to present and that we'll work through together are highly simplified, and that's intentional. Inside your organization, you may have a lot of complexity, and we'll speak to that a little bit. But for the purposes of time today, we want to make sure that people have some familiarity with the concepts without getting bogged down too deeply into the weeds. Sam will take you through some best-in-class planning examples at the end of the session, and then wrap it up with some upcoming resources. So as we get started, I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the common challenges that we run into when we're working with clients in our budgeting. And the first and most obvious is that budgeting is so often done in silos. Each part of the organization tends to work through their budget, especially if you're doing a more of a bottom-up budgeting process. They work through their plans for the coming year, their budget needs. Those different requests are rolled up to a larger number. And the one thing you know for sure is that that number will be more money than you have. And then you will go through a process of telling them how much money they should have been trying to spend in the first place, and they get to redo all their work again. The second common challenge that we run into is missing key information. And by that, we mean choosing how to spend your budget is one of the most important decisions that a marketing organization will make. In order to make that decision well, you have to understand your objectives and a realistic expectation of what it would cost to achieve those objectives. So there's pre-work before you get into budgeting planning that can be challenging, but it's critical to do it well. Next, treating it as a project and not a process. It is not everyone's most favorite time of the year. I get that. This is not Christmas for marketers. The time to do your annual budgeting can be hard work. There are tools like Acadia that can make it easier, but it's still hard work. But it's not something that we just rush through and try to get done, and now we can wash our hands of it for the rest of the year. Proper budgeting is a process. It's a process that incorporates along the way the key voices necessary to make good unified decisions and to avoid a lot of iteration in the process that's unnecessary. But it's also ongoing throughout the year. It's constantly reading and reacting to the conditions in your business and making adjustments to that plan. So it's not a one and done process. The final challenge that people run into a lot is focusing too much on what's been done. And it's human nature. You're looking at a lot of detail around spend in your organization. And the easiest thing to do is start with what you did before. And to make let's not reinvent the wheel. That's a good way to say it. What we're going to talk about today is it's not reinventing the wheel, but it's understanding that, the two wheels you used last year may need to be four. So let's hand it over to Sam a bit to talk about why this is such a critical piece for people to look at now.
Yeah, thanks, Brett. Thanks for setting all that up. And as Brett alluded to, this is really where Acadia plays as a software vendor that helps marketers with their financial planning, budgeting and tracking, and then ultimately using that data to connect it with downstream systems like Salesforce to measure ROI. And so, we feel strongly in what we've seen in our customer base, particularly over the last year and a half, as COVID has hit and we've had to make changes and choices very quickly, is that the urgency around this is greater than it's ever been before. If you look on the right side of this slide, you have mandate for revenue growth. That's maybe not something brand new, but it's becoming more and more a priority for CMOs and their teams, driving efficiency with marketing spend. Again, we saw a lot of changes on how marketers budgeted and adjusted that spend on a very quick time frame, and it was focused on that efficiency. And then resource constraints, nothing new here for marketing, but knowing where the dollars are today and where they need to be spent and adjusted, and then what's working and what's not. Again, that just continues to become more and more important. And I'll actually paraphrase one of our customers and what she said, and this really drives home the point. What she said, let's even take a step back when it comes to planning. Budget is, and I'm paraphrasing, budget is the greatest representation of your strategy. You're writing a check, that's your strategy. You can put something else on a PowerPoint slide, but if you're not following through where you're putting your resources, your time and money, then you're not staying true to your strategy. And so being able to represent that both in a framework that makes sense, which Brett will share today, and follow that through with tools like Acadia's software, then you're going to be challenged to follow through on such a strategy. So, Brett, bring us to the good stuff.
All right. So what do I mean by strategic budget allocation? It's a collaborative process for marketing budget planning that focuses on aligning as much of your spend as possible directly against your marketing objectives. It helps to drive down the habitual spending, the spending that's just based on past patterns that maybe haven't been reevaluated like they should have been. It tries to help streamline decision-making to shorten planning cycles. It still has iteration in the process, but it's built in and strategic, not something that's going to go on and push you past your budgeting schedules. And finally, it's a process that incorporates actively monitoring spend in progress to allow in-period adjustments. And that's why tools like Acadia can be so helpful in implementing a process like this, because that insight is so critical in order to be able to optimize your spend before it's too late. We like to describe it as top-down meets bottom-up. And what I mean by that is that it's primarily a top-down budgeting process where we're taking a series of increasingly granular allocation decisions based on objectives in the organization. And then when we reach a point where we have the allocated budget for each of the different parts of our marketing organization, we allow the experts on the ground who are hands-on and the execution teams to do bottom-up planning with the allocated pool that they've been given to build out the detailed plan that could best meet the objectives for their part of the business. One thing I like to call out before we go deep into the process is it's critically important in order to do a process like this that you have a marketing measurement framework in place. And when I talk about a framework, I'm talking about one that lets you do measurement for each level of the organization. It's got to have performance objectives defined for each level of the organization. If you have regions, business units, if you have industry segments, if you have a campaign hierarchy broken down into distinct targets, it's critical that the organization has gone through a planning process that allows you to have objectives that ladder up, so that when you have aligned goals, the goals at the lower levels of the organization add up to achieve the goal above. Now, each part of the organization will have its own specific goals, and it will have goals maybe that don't align to a higher level organization. But for those that do, you need to not only be able to understand those goals at each level, you need to be able to measure against them, both your performance and your spend. And that's where, again, we talk about a tool like Acadia that allows you to create your custom hierarchy for your business, because it needs to be able to account for the complexity of your business. If your organization is broken into business units, regions, product lines, audience segments, you need to be able to track both performance and spend against goals in each of those lenses. Okay, so enough of the setup. Let's take a look at what the process actually is. So a process is a 6-phase process, and each of these phases have some similar traits. Each one has an identified set of participants. Each one is taking inputs from previous work and making a specific budget allocation decision. And each one contains a validation step where you look at the decisions you made, you talk to affected parties, and you understand whether you need to make any changes to that decision or even potentially prior decisions as you go forward. We'll talk a bit more about that later. Some of the key inputs that you need to dive into this process, you have to have, as I just mentioned, the aligned marketing objectives throughout your organization, including regions, BUs, functional teams. You need to have clear audience segmentation and campaign strategy. You need to know how marketing is planning to attack it, and in Forrester's terminology, a campaign, I should call that out. We think of a campaign as all of the marketing activity, including brand and reputation, demand, customer engagement, sales enablement, all of the marketing activity that is driving toward a specific buyer need, a specific solution that you're providing to a specified need in the target market. And that usually goes on for more than a year. So you need to have a clear picture of how you're going to market and how to organize your spend against that. And then finally, and this is one that I don't want to gloss over, you need to have some historical data. You need to be able to understand both past performance and past budgeting choices in order to inform the decisions that you're making going forward. Now we're going to go through each of these steps, and for a couple of them, we're going to have exercises, as Sam mentioned, that we'll jump to, and I'll help guide you through that when we get there. But we'll start at the highest level, the first one, the marketing objectives phase. So during this first phase, it focuses on senior marketing leaders determining the top level fiscal year allocation for the marketing function. We don't ask them to chase a whole lot of complexity at that point. That decision, that big pool of funds is often driven as a percentage of projected revenue, a slight step up or down from the prior year. But that bulk number of what marketing should hit is the first decision that they make. Then in this phase, they're trying to break that out into personnel and programs. These are highly simplified categories, but what we mean by that is personnel is referring to that fully burdened employee cost, all the compensation, benefits, training, any travel that's not specific to a campaign. Okay, that's what we mean by personnel. People will call it headcount. There's also things like CapEx spend that we don't really include in this process because they're more locked into a finance process. So when we talk about programs, that's everything else. That is all of the remaining discretionary marketing budget that you have to chase your campaign objectives, your business objectives for marketing. And one of the processes that people tend to go through to prep for this, in addition to the having a strong marketing planning capability, is some sort of, here's an example of one of the worksheets that we use with clients. Again, it's a fairly rudimentary example, but the idea that they look at expectations for marketing's contribution. And this is strictly a revenue focused goal. Obviously, there are lots of other types of goals and strategic imperatives for marketing. But in a revenue sense, they look through different parts of the campaign hierarchy, the different parts of the organization, and understand what the expectations are for marketing to deliver, in this case, revenue, and how those objectives will ladder up in the organization so that they can use that insight in later planning. Now we'll move on to the second phase, campaign distribution phase. So here, we're drilling down into that discretionary portion of the budget, your marketing program budget, not the personnel. And we're trying to make one big allocation, which is how much of that money can we devote to our marketing campaign spend, and how much do we need to put into out of campaign spend? So what do I mean by that? Out of campaign spend is the money that is not focused on those driving to those specific buyer needs. So there are a lot of shared services. It can be non-campaign events, big conferences, things that cross over multiple business units, product lines. It can be corporate marketing costs. The marketing operations team, near and dear to my heart, is generally considered an out-of-campaign expense. And any other special projects that are not driving toward those specific campaign needs. So now this is the point where I want to switch to our first exercise. So for those of you playing along, why don't you open up that spreadsheet that was sent along. And on the first tab, you'll see exercise 1. And let me walk you through a little bit what we're doing here. We've simplified it as best we can to get the concept across. So you literally only have to enter in one cell on this first tab, the orange one under campaigns. So here's your idea. We have a fake company here, which in this case, I made to be, excuse me, a B2B software company. They've gone through that first phase with their marketing objectives, and they've come out with 3. Again, we're trying to keep everything simple here. So their number 1 priority, and they're in priority order for a reason, because it helps you make budgeting decisions. The number 1 priority is that they are going to drive $2 million in revenue, marketing generated revenue, from an annual user conference. That's 20% of their total revenue they generate a year. Their second priority is that they need another $8 million in marketing generated revenue from their campaign activities. And finally, there's a strategic imperative that's not about revenue, where they need to improve their public relations and analyst relations team output. So they are trying to earmark $200,000 in budget to them. So what we're going to do is figure out how much can you still allocate to campaigns in order to achieve that number. And there's really 2 ways that people do this step. One is you try to figure out what your requirements are for out of campaign spend, and then you give everything else you can to campaigns. The alternate is that you focus first on what it's going to take to achieve your campaign objectives, and then you come back and look at what you have left for out of campaign. Because out of campaign tends to be closer to a fixed cost for most organizations than the campaign spend does, normally number 1 is how we do it. We figure out what's the requirement to meet our out of campaign obligations, and we earmark everything else. That's what we're going to do. So your exercise, your challenge, is to enter a percentage. You can just type the number, it'll turn it into percent for you, into the orange box on your screen, and find out how much can you give to campaigns and meet the objectives that they're outlined here. So the spreadsheet is filled in to do the calculation for you. You have a shared services budget that's locked in under contract at around $315,000 a year. You have the big annual event, which is your number 1 priority. And so we fixed that at $800,000, which is the estimated cost based on past events to execute that properly. And we've put that target of PR/AR spend at $200,000. So what you're really doing is you're manipulating your communications team's budget, which is the only other element we've done here. So just take a minute, play with that, and see if you're able to figure out what % of campaign spend can you apply.
So while you all play around with this, and I give Brett a chance to catch his breath, not talk the entire time, I want to react to a couple of things that Brett said. So, first thing, like early on, Brett was talking about how this is complex, particularly for large organizations, and often this is done in silos. And I will say, through my experience with customers, like it is complex. This is not easy. So Brett simplified this for us. It's often harder than this, but it's also why you have a framework. The second thing is, as Brett's breaking these out, these are some great examples that we see customers doing this in Allocadia, and just in general, a best practice tool agnostic. It's like you get this big check from finance, from your CFO, and the first thing you're going to say is, how am I going to split that up between my people versus my programs? And then a best practice is this splitting up between out of campaign and in campaign. You know, one thing I tell customers, and I think Brett would agree with, you should expect stuff to be out of campaign. You should invest in this. It is part of your marketing mix. So it's a good thing to have dollars being spent out of campaign. The other thing that where I see companies kind of stubbing their toe is they start trying to do this budget allocation, but they haven't necessarily defined what a campaign is. And again, this is where partners like a Forrester come in. They can help you with that global definition of a campaign, so that France is saying a campaign is the same thing as Japan, as Australia is, or different product lines, so that you can put these frameworks in place and so that you can allocate the dollars as in a form and fashion in this way. So, Brett, I think we've probably given folks good time to go through this, so I'll hand it back over to you.
Yeah, and why don't we pop up our first poll question now that people have had a chance to play here, and let us know what you decided based on those objectives given. What's the maximum amount that you would allocate to campaigns and still meet those out of campaign requirements? All right, you see the numbers coming in. Thank you. Very active group. Okay, it's starting to slow down. So, Hida, why don't we close out the poll and let people see what their peers on the call were finding here. So what you'll see, hopefully you see the results of the poll popping up for you now. The winning answer is 68%, which is the max number. And I'll on my screen here, I will fill that in for you. It is the max amount that you can do in round percentages and into campaigns and still hit at least 220,000 in the communications budget. So now let's move ahead to the next phase. Thank you everybody for playing along there. So when we move on to the next phase of the process, now we're in the campaign design phase. And the idea here is that the participants tend to shift here from senior marketing leadership now to a group of leaders who are functional leaders overseeing portfolio, demand, customer marketing. And they're building out their campaign strategy, their campaign hierarchy. And in the examples that we're going to look at, I keep it very simple with having just a few campaigns listed. But in most organizations, campaign itself can be a multi-layered process. You can have parent campaigns with specific themes that are broken down into sub-campaigns for different industries, or campaigns that are more prospect focused than customer focused. So what we're trying to do here is allocate that campaign budget against the specific campaign framework that you have put in place, based on those goals that have been assigned to each of those campaigns. So the idea here is that we're looking to allocate budget against campaigns to the extent needed to hit each individual objective. To do that, you have to have some understanding of your history in order to understand how much money do we think it would take approximately to actually achieve the goal that we've set aside for that campaign, and then figure out, do we have enough money to do that? So let's go back to your worksheet. Let's go to the second tab, which is exercise 2. So this will now have carried over your detail from your first choice. And the goal here is to fill in 3 orange boxes, which are the percentages of that campaign spend that you'll put against each of these different campaigns. We've kind of simplified this into just 4 campaigns. And each one of them you can see has a revenue objective. Here we have campaign A has an objective of achieving 2.8 million in marketing generated revenue, which is 35% of the full 8 million goal. So again, you're just filling in those 3 boxes. The 4th one, campaign D, will calculate for you to keep it at 100%. So how do you make a choice like that? We have some information about it on the right-hand side, but what we typically see with clients is they may start at a fairly rudimentary level saying, all right, I've run similar campaigns before, I had this much money, I got this result, I need more than that, so I'm going to try to incrementally increase that campaign. What we work with them on is something we call reverse waterfall analysis, which is, it's not deep math, but the idea is that you are taking your history inside each segment that you target. You're looking at your past wins, your average deal size. You're looking at the conversion rates through your sales pipeline to understand how many deals you needed to find, how many inquiries it took to get that many deals, or how many leads if you're in the lead funnel. We tend to encourage people to think of it more as opportunities and buying groups, but I won't go down that whole path today. But how much does it take? How many campaign responses does it take? You're working your way through your marketing funnel, your waterfall, to the top of that exercise, and then saying, all right, and what is our, for this type of campaign and this type of segment, what is our cost per lead typically to get there? And so you're doing that reverse exercise to understand about how much money is it going to take to hit this objective that we've given this campaign, and can we do it? So for here, to speed this up, we've done that math for you. Let's say that the elves were working all night in the marketing operations team to calculate your analysis. And what you'll find is, as you enter in percentages into those 3, your estimated revenue will pop up right here to the right, based on that reverse waterfall analysis calculation that says, if I have this much to spend and we perform these campaigns according to the same type of performance levels we had in the past, we could expect marketing generated revenue of about this much. So please go ahead, see if you can play with those numbers and get yourself to a point where you can achieve your campaign objectives.
So I'll play filler again. I do sometimes I wonder, like, marketing operation and Al, sometimes people do think that, just send over the request. And so I have empathy as well. I think this is where, again, that definition of campaign and in a way of breaking out, of course, the spend, but that strategy. And Brett, you talked about top down and then bottom up. This is the beauty of that top down, where you have to start making your way, I guess, down the layers of the strategy and the organization, however you want to look at it. And the campaign framework in this sense is, what I've seen with customers is something really powerful on how to organize it. But this is also where that complexity comes, because you're starting to think about it almost in matrix. So making sure you think about, and Brett will get into this, but making sure you take that into account, that matrix, while using a framework. And then we'll talk about, well, and then that's where eventually that bottom up comes in to make the reality happen. But it's a dance. So I love the way this is laid out, and I think it's a great way to start simplifying some of the complexities of organization.
And this is a part of the process where that validation phase at the end of the step, where we're having to say, okay, did our decisions make sense? This is one where the rubber meets the road pretty often for people, where we have a serious objective for this fake company of $8 million in campaign revenue. We made a choice in the previous step of how much we could give to campaigns to meet what we thought our out of campaign expenses would be. If you find in this part of the process that you're not able to make it add up, if you can't find a percentage that can give budget fully to meet this goal, then you may need to revisit your previous tab and adjust that 68% in order to give yourself the money you need to hit this objective.
And I know we got to move on, but I love that point where this is part of the planning process, where you're iterating, you're going back and forth, some negotiation within your leadership team and within marketing. But it is like, if you start going through the planning process like this and it's not looking right, if you haven't funded in the way to hit your goals, adjust it, change. Like I wholeheartedly agree with that, Brad.
Let's go ahead and pop up the next set of polls, Ada. So here they've got a couple of questions. The first is, we're asking, were you able to hit these budget objectives with the money that you had allocated in step one? And then the second question is, which of these allocations is closest to the one that you were able to find? And I'm gonna just stall here a few more seconds because I'm curious to see people's answers before I will fill this out for you to kind of show you thinking, because I want to make sure that this okay, yeah, I can see as the answers are coming in, people are pretty well tuned into what to the game I was playing here. So as you went through this process and started filling out these percentages, you know, and in this case, there is an answer that can hit with roundish numbers. You will find as you're playing with it, if you went with the 68% that maxed out the out of campaign, that you're coming up just short. So when you move back to exercise one, you could say, all right, these were locked in. Communications is what I had to play with. If I move this up, and I'm just shortcutting it for the purpose of time, if I move this up to 70%, we're making a cut in communications, but communications is not one of our priorities for the year. PR and AR is, the annual event is, shared services is pretty much locked in costs. But if we moved it to 70%, now these percentages will hit our numbers. And so can we close that poll and show people where people landed? So what you'll see in these poll results now is that there are some people who were able to make it because they already had gone ahead and given a higher number to campaigns in the first step. But for those of you who didn't, you almost entirely got those same percentages that you were closest to 40, 20, 25, 15. So that tells me that the people playing along kind of get the concept that we're going for here, which is great to see. I'm going to switch back now to the presentation and move on to the next phase. The functional alignment phase. This one's critical. So this one does have allocation decisions. They all do. And in this phase, that allocation decision is trying to break out our spend against our corporate hierarchy. When we have geographies, business units, industry segments, we may have different functional leaders in each of those groups. We also are trying to make an allocation decision against what we call program families, which are reputation spend. How much are we doing in brand advertising versus what we're doing in demand gen? How much are we focused on customer engagement and sales enablement? And then again, that operations budget can be thrown in there as well. That's not one of the 4 program families, but it's part of overall program spend. What we're doing here, though, is we're broadening our tent. So at this point, we've had a fairly streamlined decision-making process. We've made decisions in the senior marketing leadership team, in functional leaders in charge of demand marketing, you know, and portfolio marketing, customer marketing, depending on how your organization is structured. Now we need to let all of those other key decision makers, those leaders, those regional leaders, BU leaders, and it's a great time to talk to sales and say, here's the plan. What do you think? Get that feedback before you get to more granular allocations, because once you get your execution team started in building out detailed plans, you don't want to be going back and changing that number on them often. So this is your time to say, here's what we're thinking. Here are our strategic priorities that came out of marketing planning. Here's our campaign approach, how we believe we're going to take the charge and make those things happen. And here's how much money we're planning to allocate across. And then you work on breaking it out into your more complex business structure. Here, I'm going to go back to the worksheet, but rather than have you do an exercise, I'm just going to show you a quick example of how people tend to think about this. Tab 3 is an example where we've now taken each of those campaigns and we have said at a high level, campaign level over on the right, how do we need to break out those different program families? How much should we be spending for reputation versus demand? So here in this example, you can be looking at an organization that is heavily embedded in the enterprise segment. They are looking to spend 50% of their marketing spend on customer engagement because they have a saturated market where a lot of the marketplace is customers. They may be making an aggressive move into the SMB segment, and they're putting 55% of their demand or spend into demand, trying to drive leads there, and upping their reputation to be better known in that area. And so each of these different campaigns, they work across different segments. Not every segment applies, but you can see here what they're doing is they're starting with those kind of default breakouts, and they're looking to, do I need to make adjustments inside any of those key segments, inside any of those campaigns? And they're just kind of working through their planning of where that money is going to go at a high level, which is allowing them to give more detailed plans over to the execution teams. And then I don't have an example of it here because it differs so much by people's organizations of business unit breakouts, geographic breakouts. And Ada, that'd probably be a great time to pop that next poll up, which is asking you a little bit about your business. So it's not the exercise in this case. It is your actual business. What kind of structural challenges are you having to plan for when you create your marketing budget planning, when you're trying to track your spend and performance against your framework? What kind of complexity are you trying to manage in your business?
And Brett, as I fill this out, this is kind of where I was alluding to around matrix and complexity, even in the last slide. This starts really getting into it, and I'm always interested in seeing where are the challenges, because some of that is a process or definition challenge. Sometimes it's a enablement to market the field challenge, and sometimes it's a tool challenge. But it's always interesting whether in this scenario we're talking with marketers, customers, prospects, whomever, where those pains lie.
All right. And the responses are starting to slow down a little bit. So maybe we close that one out and show people the challenges that their colleagues, their peers on the call are dealing with. So we see that, so here 69% of respondents are having to deal with not just campaigns, but parent-child campaigns that break out industries and segments. And that's really common. And when you're doing that level of planning, you need to be able to track your spend against those different levels in order to see how efficiently you're achieving the objectives at each of those levels. Business units, 2/3 of the companies are having to deal with separate business units. More than half have geographic breakdowns. And the second question is really interesting to me because it's something we run into when we're helping organizations with their planning. There is no clear consensus on what is the right way to organize your hierarchies. So we found here that 38% of you were saying that global campaigns are at the top of your hierarchy, and underneath that, you break down those campaigns by geography and industry. And that tends to be the way Forrester starts our thinking, because we're trying to get people focused on a relatively small number of campaigns that are each focused on a key business need that your product, solution, service fills. But 28% of you start with geography at the top, and you may have different campaigns inside each geography. And 34% are starting with business units. And a lot of times in that structure, those business units are almost operating independently. So you're trying to look for ways to drive consistency across that. So your hierarchy looks very custom to your organization, which is why, again, I always say a tool like Acadia can be really helpful because it needs to be able to be customized to your results. Okay. We are going to push forward, and thank you everybody for your engagement. That's wonderful. The fifth phase, second to last, the execution strategy phase. Here is the detailed marketing campaign program tactic planning that execution teams deal with. The idea is that leadership groups have now made strategic decisions in order to drive spend into each of the areas of your marketing organization at a level they believe is appropriate to achieve your goals. But now you need the experts at executing marketing to start bottom-up planning and say, given that pool of money, what is the most efficient, most effective way that I can build a marketing strategy to achieve those objectives? And this is the same point where you should be going into more detail, by the way, in your out of campaign spend that we kind of left earlier. Here's where the people in charge of those different out of campaign components are also building their plan for the year. We encourage people to build an annual plan, but a lot of them will go a lot more detail into Q1, Q2, understanding that we also are talking about constantly updating. So it's a strategic choice whether you want to get fully robust plan for 4 quarters, knowing you're going to change it, or whether you want to be very detailed in the first part of your next fiscal period, and then be a little bit more gray later, understanding that things are likely to change. So when people are building these plans, the validation step for this phase is marketing leadership has to look and recognize, do these plans make sense with this amount of budget? Do they have overspend, underspend in their plan? Do these tactics make sense according to the objectives? So there's some back and forth there with the execution teams to make sure that everybody's still aligned on driving toward those goals. And marketing leadership can be stepping in here to help answer questions when there are priorities in conflict. And that's one of the reasons we say we don't just want objectives, we want objectives that are prioritized, because rarely does everyone have all the money they need to hit every objective they hope to achieve. So people need to be able to have some guidance about what supersedes what in order to identify issues when there's gaps in order to be able to resolve those. So the final thing that you're looking at when you do this is, once you see these plans start shaping up, keep in mind that this process can change spending patterns from the past. And your organization was probably built around those spending patterns. For example, you may have an events marketing team. In the past, if you gave $500,000 to the events marketing team, they were going to spend $500,000 on events. And it may be that that is not the best use of money in your current situation for your new set of objectives. So do you have the right amount of personnel dedicated to an events marketing team if events just took a hit? Should some of them be focused on other areas? So you need to recognize, and some of those can be uncomfortable conversations, they don't have to be, but recognize, does our spending plan line up with our org structure? This is the phase where senior leaders tend to take a look at that. Then we'll move on here to the final phase, which is the value tracking phase. This is where the project becomes a continuous process. What we're looking at in this phase is, as execution begins, we are trying to, as quickly as possible, track both performance and spend inside each area to make sure that we're aligning the plan. And it's just as important to track underspend as overspend. The reason for that is that it is critical to be able to recapture in period some spend if it is not being used effectively, and divert it into areas where maybe you're missing a critical priority, you're not achieving everything you hoped, and you want to put some more funding against that, or you are killing it in an area that you're very excited about and you realize you now have an opportunity bigger than you realized and you want to move some money into that. But it's critical to have real-time visibility, as close to real-time as you can get, into not just your performance, but in how much has been committed, how much has been spent, so that you can make those in-period allocation adjustments. Sam, I'm guessing that this is an area that's near and dear to your heart.
You got me smiling. Even the last slide, I got on these hours with my pen out. I'm taking notes and underlying because I want to come back and call it up. But you talk about metadata, and you talk about that, and you want this metadata and the right data flowing through all of your systems. So whether it's your planning and budgeting tool, your marketing automation, your CRM, your analytics platform, whatever that might be. And yeah, you need that data flowing. You need the value tracking, and then you need the ability to adjust and reallocate, as you mentioned, Brett. It's music to my ears.
All right. So let's wrap this part of it up and kind of bring it all together for you. We started with that first marketing objectives phase, and we took a marketing budget allocation. In this example, in the worksheet, we started with a $10 million example and made the breakout. We did it before the example started, just for the sake of time, where they decided, all right, we've got 51% in personnel, that leaves 49% in programs. And we see numbers like that in the validation step there. We'll see, depending on your industry, your business size, we'll see numbers in programs as low as 48, 49%. We'll see as high as 62% get into programs. Then the first exercise that we did is we needed to figure out how much we could put into campaign spending in that in phase 2. And so we did that by breaking out our out of campaign requirements and diverting everything we could into campaign spending. In the third phase, we put money against each of our campaigns according to their objectives and goals. And the historical analysis that had been done by the marketing operations analysts ahead of time to figure out about how much money is it going to take to realistically hit those objectives. And in the way we set up the worksheet, it was typical that you would have to go back and make some adjustment to an earlier choice in order to hit that number as intended. And then you work down through, you can see at the bottom of the example, you have different segments inside your campaigns. In a fully built out system, according to the poll that we just saw, you're going to have at that point regions, business units, industry segments, and you're going to be making increasingly detailed decisions and handing that money out. And then finally, the annual plan. Now we want to kick it over to Sam here to talk you through some more specific examples of how people are putting this into action.
Yeah, so I'm going to walk through 2 examples and give you some more great content that's coming up that's related to this planning, overarching planning topic. And we'll get you off to whatever might be next for you. So Brett, thanks for walking us through that. Now let's talk about a couple of real life examples, Acadia customers, but not necessarily Acadia specific, but more this framework specific. So Autodesk, great customer, great marketing organization. They had a lot of those pains that, Brett, you talked about early on in the presentation. Marketers in siloed, poor ability to track against that spend, and thus they couldn't relate that to their performance. So they brought in Acadia, central source of truth around, again, those plans, those financial plans, the budgets, so that it could support their overarching MPM program. So you taught marketing performance management program. I guess not everyone knows that 3-letter acronym potentially. But Brett, you talked about how it's not a project, it's a process. Sometimes I'd even go further, say it's an entire program. This does not stop. At points you're doing the budget allocation and planning. Other points you're executing and getting that performance data back and reallocating. It doesn't stop. For better or for worse. So they think of it as a program. I would recommend everyone thinks of it as an overarching program. And then where'd they end up? They did bring in this campaign specific approach. So before really that structure wasn't in place, now 86% they're able to connect to a campaign. So it's not necessarily in campaign versus out of campaign, but they've gone from 0 being able to say, hey, this is the point of it around campaigns to 86, so more than 3/4 of their spend they're able to track, which is impressive for a global multi-billion-dollar organization. As Brett said at the beginning, this is not easy. All right, if we go to the next slide, Brett, I can keep us moving forward. The next one is National Instruments. So this is a few years back, but National Instruments, a good friend of mine, Helena Lewis brought in the then Serious Decisions, now Forrester Decisions campaign framework. They actually went down from 90 countries to, I think it was a subset of 20 to 30 geos. So they changed the way they planned all holistically, and they went from a bunch of different messy spreadsheets, which no one on this call ever manages their budgets or plans in messy spreadsheets or PowerPoints. I am sure of it. And they needed to find a single system to track this and to enable this new process. They did not start with the system, they started with the process and bringing in experts like the Forresters, like the Bretts to help them define that. I will say that they did customize it slightly, their campaign framework, to work for their organization, which is not uncommon from what I see for multi-billion-dollar organizations. They don't throw the framework out totally, but they tweak it to make it work for their complex organization. So what that ended up being is Acadia reports were pulled in from various functions and dimensions, from media to planning to all sorts of metadata, which we brought up, and they're able to validate their alignment between their new go-to-market, their reorganization of, again, their geographies, and align to their go-to-market plans and budgets. So in both cases, you're thinking about organization. None of these organizations were doing anything wrong to start. They wanted to move forward, being more efficient and effective with their spend. They brought in a framework, a point of view. They brought in experts to help them with this process. And then they brought in a tool, Acadia, to enable their marketers to do the work they needed to execute and see through that strategy, which again, strategy, the budget is going to be the best representation of your strategy. Bring in the experts, put in the right process and framework, enable with the right tools, systems, and processes, and continue to teach, train, reiterate. And you also can get best-in-class examples at some point. I know we can get you there. So that was fairly quick, but I'm excited about these. I want to give everyone a few minutes either to ask questions or even to get to the next meeting. So was this content good? I thought it was great. This is planning season for a lot of large organizations. 6 months out, fiscal, if you're on an annual fiscal, usually planning is starting to ramp up now. So start thinking about this. We have a couple of examples here. So the first one on June 8th, and we'll get you this on a follow-up in an email. So Poly previously planned Tronics, how they solved the do more with less challenge. They actually put in the serious decisions, and now Forrester decisions campaign framework, and aligned their entire planning process, and eventually their budgeting and tracking process against this. So what it did provide was efficiency in all of their resources. I think it was something like they were able to do 60% more activities or campaigns with the same amount of resources. Then on June 15th, we're going to have a great panel of folks from On24, Bombora, and then Jeremy Audrum from Zoom Info. I think he was on the call if he's still there, one of my favorites. We're going to talk about the new roles for marketing in the post-pandemic world, which sounds a little like post-pandemic. It's still a little like woo, pandemic. I still get that. But what we have seen is from COVID and the learnings from marketing organizations, a lot of these organizations have learned and done better and created improvements in their planning process, in how they spend money. And we want to share those so that as you go into your planning process or wherever you might be, you can take those on your merry way. So let's see. I think we've got one more poll that we're going to pop up. And so again, Acadia, we are a software company that helps organizations like the one you see on your screen, Poly, etc., plan, manage their investment dollars, and tie those back to results, all for marketing. So if you would like to get more information on Acadia, how we help these organizations, the Autodesk, the National Instruments, the Polys, the On24s of the world, say yes, and we'll have somebody reach out to you and give you an overview. So I got one question for you, Brett, while we and then we'll finish up so that we can let people go on their merry way. This was great. I mentioned something.
No.
What'd you say?
I said I'm a Scorpio. Was that? No, it wasn't.
Well, it's good to know. I mentioned that the National Instrument, that they adjusted the framework a bit for their organization. When you go and work with customers and they're like, this is great, but can we tweak this or that? What's your guidance?
Yes, you can, and we do it almost every time. It's one of the reasons that it makes it so difficult to do in spreadsheets. So we have, for our clients, we have, example spreadsheets of here's a way to think this through. None of them can be locked in place because nobody's structure is the same. But what we try to do is make sure that they understand that the structure that they're looking at is trying to drive around people who have authority and accountability for each of those areas. So the structure you're breaking out is you're wanting to understand that you have people in your organization who have accountability over a certain area, and they need to have objectives for their area and tracking against it. And then underneath that, you need to figure out which parts of your market are likely to have different results. So you have a campaign like, do I need to go 7 segments? Do I need to go 3 segments? It's like, well, are the results going to change? Are the message going to change? Are your response rates going to change? So it's the hierarchy ends up getting as complex as your business is. And we always try to get people to the simplest answer that they can get. But if you're talking to very different types of people that have very different types of performance history, you end up having to break those out. So the hierarchies do get fairly complex. But the good news is that once you've gone through that planning process, once you've built out that hierarchy, your performance tracking, you're associating to those different specific programs or tactics that you're running, your spend is getting associated as granular as possible. And so hopefully you've got reporting built out that rolls them both up, and you can look at any of those lenses because you put the work in ahead of time.
Thanks, Brett. I love that answer. And I think, what are the insights that you want out to help you make better decisions? Start there and then work with smart people like Brett to adjust the frameworks in place. And then hopefully work with great companies like Acadia to put them into your system. But mostly work with smart people like Brett. All right, one last chance to pop a yes in there if you'd like to learn more about Acadia on our software and how we help these marketing organizations around the financial planning, marketing financial planning, the budget management, and then ultimately connecting those to downstream results like a Salesforce to measure ROI. Happy to walk. Of course, we'd be happy to walk you through that. So we're going to wrap up now. Brett, thank you. This was great. I've already gotten a few comments from folks that I know about how great the session was. So it was a pleasure. And thank you everyone for taking the time to join us. We know that you have many, many options of what you'd like to do during your day with your schedule and competing priorities. So we're honored to have you join us.